in this county and elsewhere as well, wherever you may have come from. And I've been thinking about native plants and plant communities my entire career, and really encouraging people to recreate or restore their landscapes to something that is more natural. I've been doing a blog for some time called Natural Gardening about my own and Tim's own landscape. And I'll be sharing some things about that with you. And I'm quite an informal person, so if you have questions, just ask along the way. And this is also a program that we'll talk about things to add, things to subtract, things to do. And it's a fairly simple process. We're basically being nature when we create a native woodland garden or a natural woodland garden. And sometimes we have to do a little extra work depending on what you start with. Eastern deciduous woodland, as you know, and I'm not quite sure why this is flickering like this now, but we can, maybe that's what's happening. Well, no. Really stretches, we share a lot of the same same forest types, forest communities, even the same plants. Why don't we do that? We'll just see if it'll reboot somehow. How many of you have come from elsewhere to this wonderful part of the world? Okay, and that's typical when I ask people that. Well, yeah. When I normally ask people that in programs, it can be lots of people from the Northeast, lots of people from the Southeast, occasionally people from, oops, there we go. Well, I wonder what, but in any case, in some cases, we know a lot of the plants already. In other cases, we may be new to the area, new to natural history, and we're like, oh man, there are all these plants. Or I do a lot of landscape, 2-hour landscape consultations as benefits for the gardens that I teach at. And I had a couple who's moved here from California. Now, Tim Spira, my spouse, and I came to the Southeast 30 years ago, all new plants. So those of you that may have come from from New York, it's not all new plants, just some new plants. So we all start somewhere. So you probably know that we've got a number of different kinds of forest types, from oak hickory forest, northern hardwood forest, alluvial forest along stream sides, lots more of them too. And here's just a map that shows you some of the variation. And in this part of North Carolina, and really all over the western North Carolina, we have a lot of diversity in elevation, as you know, land use history, what soil types we have, and what kind of forest types we have. If you go on a hike up in Chimney Rock, for instance, along that trail from the lower bit on up, you pass through rich hardwood, rich cove forest, to acidic cove forest, to rich cove forest. As you go on up towards Hickory Nut Falls, rich cove forests are the ones that are so species rich. Some of you know Station Cove Falls, Pearson's Falls here, because of that neutral pH. Wonderful fairyland of herbaceous wildflowers. We have lots more acidic cove forests, but those are the forest types that most of our eastern U.S. landscape wants to come back to forest in some way. We clear it for pasture, we clear it for farmland, but the forest wants to come back. Of course, we also have the non-native things that are coming along, and they go, here I am, and they need to be dealt with too. But these cove forests are normally what we think of native woodlands here in the northeastern U.S. You know, with that rich understory of wildflower species, yeah.
On that previous slide, could you show Where's the Piedmont Plain?
You know, that's a good question. It's not very obvious, is it? The spine of the Appalachians, which some of you probably know go all the way up to the northern tip that goes down into the sea and the Gaspé Peninsula, are really here, the Blue Ridge and there. The Piedmont Plain has got to be kind of in that area. It's not real clear. In the Piedmont, some of you may have heard Tim talk about, you know, his book about wildflower ecology. And he talks about 21 different plant communities, and he's including both the Piedmont and the mountains. There are many of those same plant communities. So it's not so different. The Piedmont's still quite rolling than it is here in the mountains.
So everything east of the Continental Divide is the Piedmont Plain?
No, there's all kinds of different features of that. I mean, there are many different names for these areas, and they differ in soil types. And the Piedmont Plain would just be a very small area. And the Piedmont, just in general, we talk about as the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, sometimes stretching all the way up to Raleigh, you know, on up in a broad swath. And then when you get down into the geological details, they have much more technical names, you know, the Cumberland Plateau and the Blue Ridge Mountains, and so it gets more detailed. Yeah, or the Midlands, which is in South Carolina, is sort of a general term. You could start breaking that down into where the different areas, they're geological descriptions as well as the plant community descriptions. And so where you are can be fairly specific. So good example, lots of our hardwoods, white oaks, so we'll talk about some of these common trees that are part of our forests. I already mentioned Tim's book that he organizes by plant communities, and that's been a really interesting thing. As plant ecologists, we think about the world like this. You know, is this a hardwood forest here? So when I'm driving here to this place, I'm looking around at what the landscapes look like to me. Are these planted pines? Does this look like a hardwood forest? Is this a dry chestnut oak forest ridge? Is this, you know, how disturbed is it? What is, you know, that's the kind of thing. And what are the characteristics plants? What would you expect to find there? And this kind of created garden is not what you'd expect to find except in a rich cove forest. And I noticed Patrick McMillan, our director at the South Carolina Botanical Garden, is going to talk in November. We have at the South Carolina Botanical Garden a wonderful planted, or I should say enriched area that is a rich cove forest garden, right next to an acidic cove forest garden. And this is part of our Natural Heritage Garden Trail, and it's full of really fabulous plantings. This is definitely the projector, not my laptop, I'm afraid. Yeah, we'll just hope that the light stays, the bulb holds out.
I don't think it's the bulb, it's the connection.
Oh, sorry. You think it's the connection?
Yeah, but it's not on your computer, it's on that tower.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, we'll just ignore it anyway. It's not like the old days when we had carousel projectors, different. But we have lots of wonderful plants we can add to our gardens. These are just some examples. This is one of the signs at our botanical garden that I had done for the original Woodland wildflower garden. Basic plants that are found there. This was the one I did for the Rich Cove Forest that I just mentioned. That garden's quite recent. What you add when you have fertile, almost pH neutral soils is this tremendous diversity. You can have Virginia bluebells, you can have certain kinds of orchids. You pick up Dutchman's breeches or speckled wood lilies or black cohosh. We don't always realize, if you walk that Chimney Rock Trail, it's very marked how you change from rich cove forest to acidic cove forest just because of the understory wildflowers. Now, this is what I wanted to do in this program, and as I've developed it, is really it's always useful to think about, if you want to grow these really rare woodland wildflowers, is that the kind of native woodland you imagine? A lot of people do want to grow trilliums and lady slippers and shooting stars. Anyone in that category? But it takes a lot of work. There are a lot of easier plants to grow. So let's imagine, what kind of native woodland garden you imagine. Well, I like to use examples from our own landscapes because I found it's really kind of helpful for people to envision this. When Tim and I bought this landscape in the Piedmont, this was the front yard. Nothing but grass, acre and a half of grass, one tree. Well, geez, two plant ecologists buy an old house and how long do you spend on the riding lawnmower? Too long. And that's what that area is looking like today. So it's transformed 20 years later. So from here, we're looking at something like, that's the same view, and the view from the window is far different. And what I try to encourage people about is that it doesn't take long. Sometimes people go, oh, I'm too old, or I don't have time, or let me tell you, things grow so fast in our climate here in the Blue Ridge Escarpment, or up in the mountains, or down in the Piedmont. Because we get a lot of rain, we have great conditions for growth. And so these native trees like tulip poplars and sweet gums grow really, really fast. They also like to reproduce too, as you probably know. But that's just part of that story. We're thinking about restoration. And I like to always talk about a stewardship message, whether we have a big property that we're turning pasture into, a woodland that we're trying to make sure that we manage for the native plants, or in our case, we want to move out of this landscape, leaving behind lots of native plants in this landscape, in the front and the back, that have transformed what we bought as a lawn. And that makes, me and Tim feel real good about that. Anyway, this is just an example of what it looks like. So let me just poll. It varies a lot as to who, when I'm doing this particular program, who's in the audience. How many of you already have some woodland? Some woodland. How many? Nope, no woodland. No. Or how about a weedy thicket of invasive species? Oh, good. Oh, well, open pastures, some open pastures. Any people on streams or alluvial ravine forests, they have their own challenges. I've actually done 2 visits of people's sites here in this area, and one of them was over near in Bat Cave, or near Bat Cave in Girton. And she actually had a wonderful old cabin, but it was totally surrounded by horticultural plantings, including ivy. So what she was wanting to do is totally rip out all the non-natives to create a native garden. And she had done just a tremendously great job of it. I think just wanted me to come by and say, what I thought of it, but it was really beautiful. So we're really looking at, if you want to create, and it can be a little pocket. It doesn't need to be some vast landscape. It could be a small pocket that you're going to plant with woodland understory species, simply, or we have a little planting area up in Asheville that, I kid you not, Tim said the other day, we're sitting on the deck, he goes, that's going to be my acidic coforest planting. And I'm sort of, because we lost a sassafras and he put in a Fraser magnolia, then the Fraser magnolia didn't make it, he's putting in something else. And I think I tried to sneak something in there, and he said, no, doesn't belong in the acidic coforest. But anyway, there can be a very small little area. So assessing your site. We're acting like nature, yeah.
I have about like a 10th of an acre I want to fix up and put the small plants in it, but the trees in it are like 6
That's some sort of mix of plantings. Yeah, that's not a, and that's where most of us, the East Coast, most of us have, our landscapes have been altered tremendously. So what eastern white pine, they're in maples wouldn't normally be together, but we in small areas, lots of our more adaptable natives will be coming in and colonizing, and they could have been planted. Yeah, and we'll talk about that, because we don't always know what in our urban suburban landscapes was the landscape history of our site. Was it in lawn for 80 years like our landscape in Clemson, or was it a pasture? Was it logged? I understand that Walnut, this area here had been planted pine, and as well as woodland. So there's a lot of landscape history that affects what we see. Our whole goal, if we want to create a woodland, a natural woodland has layers. It has a canopy layer, mid-level trees, and then our understory species. The key here is that if you want to have some of those woodland wildflowers that want to be in those rich cove forests, we're talking serious soil amendment to do that. Some of you may have heard of Bill Kalina. I brought 3 of his books with me because he's just such a great resource. He used to be at Garden of the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts, that's run by the New England Wildflower Society. He was the director of horticulture. He's now at the Coastal Garden up in Maine. He points out how much work, this is an all-native garden, the founders of this garden made to create an old quarry into this fairyland native plant garden in Framingham. It included oyster shells, lots of extra lime, lots of humus, lots of wheelbarrow loads of mulch, and we're talking seriously amending the soil. So I like to joke in the Piedmont that all of our topsoil is down in Charleston Harbor because we garden in red clay subsoil. I believe I have a picture of the culprit there. Here in the mountains and in the sort of this escarpment area, what you have is very much elevation dependent, a lot of differences, and I'll show you something that illustrates that too. But what you do is you start with the easy ones to grow, and then you can work your way to these more amended beds. So basic layering that we're creating, and sometimes we have more room. And so, for instance, a white pine is a certain kind of canopy tree. Most of the canopy trees for woodlands in general are deciduous. Some of you may be in other kinds of situations too. And so the ground layer, shrub layer, understory canopy, pretty straightforward. This is a ravine that was in the back of our little house in Asheville, and all these overstory trees were there, but what the understory was honeysuckle, ivy, privet, trash. I saw on y'all's website some work at removing what looked like old sinks, old toilets. There were all kinds of things back in this ravine, that we had to haul, or Tim hauled out. I take no credit for that. But you can see you've got this kind of mess. A lot of people are faced with that. And old plantings. Do you have much English ivy that's still, people that were planted it a long time ago? Particularly, I was thinking too, as I was driving over here, is that because of the railroad grade, railroads were notorious for bringing in invasives, and then they jump. No, ivy is coming in through horticulture. But these are some of the kinds of challenges that you may have, or you have in general, in terms of creating a woodland garden. You know, your soil may be dry. There may be tremendous root competition with the existing trees, because in more urban settings, and I'm assuming most of you are not in that most of the time, but a lot of people are raking up all their leaves and shipping them off elsewhere. Keep them. You know, really, it's like, what? You're shipping them off? You know, we don't have enough organic matter, and it breaks down rapidly. Whether you're, you know, a woodland gardener, a native plant gardener, or I'm also a crazed vegetable gardener, you know, you have to keep adding organic matter. Lots of our soils are too acidic to grow some of these rich cove forest kind of wildflowers, but also more acidic than they normally would be. Too much light and too much shade, yeah. Liming is good for if you want to get the pH up. And that's what at Garden in the Woods. I didn't honestly realize this because before we started planting some of these things, we had to build up some decent kind of soil. And but to really grow some of these bluebells and things like that, liming is necessary, or you're grinding up oyster shells. I don't know where you get them actually, but how you grind them up either, I'm afraid to think about that. But definitely, if you want to have some of these fussier wildflowers, pH is really critical. For less fussy ones, it's not so critical. When we did the Rich Cove Forest Garden down at the Botanical Garden, it was an existing fern garden, or partially a fern garden with the overstory. We literally lifted all the soil, lifted it up, amended it with lots of lime, lots of leaf litter, lots of compost from the nursery area, then brought it back. We had little pockets that were higher in pH because of the runoff from the mortar up above from some of our stone wall construction projects. Can you imagine that we hit these little pockets that were higher pH? And you're thinking, well, why is that? And you realize it's because of runoff from up above. And you may find that in your own landscape. You know, if someone's dumped a bunch of wood ash over many years, it's going to be higher in pH. Here in the mountains, it's much more variable, and that you can have a lot of differences. So again, I don't mean to hammer this to death, but to grow wood wildflowers like these herbaceous wildflowers, the spring ephemerals, the wildflowers that flower in spring, summer, and fall. They really need that humus-rich soil and lots of decomposed leaves and other organic materials. Some are tougher than others. Bloodroot is really easy to grow. Yeah?
What is humus-rich?
Humus is what, if you compost, or if you dig into a decomposed leaf litter out in the woods, the humus is what's left after all the organic matter has sort of partially broken down. It sort of looks like coffee grounds, and it's spongy, and that's what humus is, more or less. So decomposed leaves, leaf mold is an old term for it. Here's the infamous subsoil. We can hit things that look like greasy, nasty clay, you know, slick-looking clay. I am hitting a lot of that up in Asheville, where there are these nasty clods. You know, anyone have that? You know, just, I mean, it's really totally anaerobic, icky stuff. This, having rocks, you know, just all kinds of variation. This is actually an area over near Franklin. If you can go on those web soil survey with the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, zoom in, and I did this yesterday for Polk County, zoom in and find your property. What you find and what you see is something like this. This is not here, but is over in Franklin. But you'll see this kind of soil mapping. It's interesting largely because you can realize, and you can see from these satellite views, how this land use history can affect what you have. You may have had that soil there, but there may have been a lot of alteration to it, you know, and you can then read the analyses of 30 to 50% slope stony in this particular kind of soil. You know, stony, this one eroded, 8%. Hayesville clay loam, you know, 8% slope eroded. And that gives you clues, and you can see how, and this is primarily useful just to make the point that there's a lot of amending that you might need to do to make a really good woodland. I really like leaves. Tim, my spouse, really likes leaves. He really, really likes leaves, and happily in Asheville, they bag them up and go around, or the homeowners bag them up, and you can go around snagging leaves. And you might have seen that oversized Volvo wagon out there. It can hold a lot of bags of leaves. This is 1 year before we had popped out the deck. You can see he's got, and I kid you not, he spread 3 loads of wood chips piles this summer alone, back in the same area. This is serious adding organic matter to your landscape. Yeah.
Wood ashes too?
The question about could you use wood ashes? You can use them judiciously to up the pH, but then you don't want to use too many of them as a soil amendment. They're really a pH amendment. Yeah.
Do you ever grind the leaves?
We don't have time to grind leaves, but lots of people do chop them up.
Speed them up?
Yeah, it'll speed up. Most of our deciduous leaves will break down fairly quickly. If they're in bags like this for a while, they break down. But they break down just fine on their own. That's what happens out in nature. They'll blow around a little bit. It just all depends on what kind of situation you're in. And you definitely don't want to use ivy, magnolia, any of these thick waxy leaves without shredding them somehow.
I have some neighbors who are so afraid that if they leave the leaves on the ground, it'll be a fire hazard. What can I tell them about that to get them to?
Wow. I thought the question was going to be about voles or snakes. Those are the other two I've heard. I've never heard a fire hazard. Wow. Did they come from the west, or did they come from the west, or why would you worry? We got so much rain.
I'm not sure about the other.
I mean, how many wildflowers do we hear about in western North Carolina? You know, not many. Well, here's a thought. I mean, you have to really work hard to do a prescribed burn, usually, to let it dry out. I mean, think about how much, yeah. I mean, in this part of this area, aren't you getting some extra, how much rainfall is normal in your here? I mean, is it like 50? 50 to 60. It's less in Asheville. It's more it's about 50 in the Piedmont. And it's evenly spread. We don't have a wildfire season.
Last year we got twice as much rain.
We had a hugely, hugely wet year for most of the Southeast 2 years ago. Yeah.
What about walnut and pecan leaves?
Well, pecan leaves, as far as I know, are fine. Black walnuts, as probably most of you know, have a allelopathic compound in them called juglone, and there are a lot of plants that can't grow under black walnut because of that. What I've read, and I haven't had any experience with this directly, is that the leaves as the leaves decompose, the juglone breaks down. So after about 3 weeks to a month, it supposedly is okay. So, but Black walnuts are kind of a different category. You can look at lists of what can grow under them.